Thank you very much for inviting me to speak at this conference. It's my first time in Ireland as well. Very glad to be here. It's been very interesting to listen to some of the presentations and the talks at this conference. Seems to me like you're facing a lot of the same challenges in the Norwegian wind industry and the Irish one. Grid is good, used to be the unofficial slogan of the Norwegian Wind Energy Association for many years. So I'm here today to talk about corporate PPAs in the Nordic. I hope it's relevant for the Irish market as well. A lot of slides, not much time, so I'll just jump right to it. So short introduction to Axpo. Axpo is a Swiss energy company. We buy and sell power and trade power all over Europe. We have a lot of renewable energy under physical management, around 14,000 megawatts currently, and about 20% of that is long-term PPAs. In the Nordics, where I'm situated, we have around 3,000 megawatts under management. And we are now also present in the Irish market. We have 140 megawatts here, and my colleague David is here as well. He's in the Irish office. So before we start talking about PPAs and corporate PPAs in the Nordics, I just want to give you an introduction to the Nordic power market. I think it's good to have this background before we start talking about PPAs. So the Nordic market is split into a physical and a financial market. The physical market is called Nord Pool Spot. I guess it's pretty similar to the Irish physical market. It's a day ahead and an intraday market. The Nord Pool area includes the Nordic countries, except for Iceland, and also the Baltics. So the day-ahead price we get a theoretical or synthetic system price that is a reference price for the whole market. But we have a lot of price areas within the Nord Pool area. In Norway, for instance, we have 5 price areas. And that takes into account all the grid congestions between the different zones. And that is the actual price that you get as a producer or consumer. And then we have the financial market. Nasdaq OMX commodities is the most commonly used market to trade Nordic power futures. This is a very important tool for companies like Axpo and for other like producers and consumers in order to hedge their power risk. And the financial exchange, they list short-term products and also products up to 10 years ahead. But unfortunately, liquidity has dropped in recent years, and there's very poor liquidity for products that are like beyond 3 years ahead. I also want to talk a little bit about the subsidy scheme in Norway and Sweden, because I think that's important when we start talking about PPAs and corporate PPAs. So we have a market-based subsidy scheme. It's technology neutral. It was introduced in Sweden in 2003, and Norway joined the market in 2012. It's been very successful. They reached the 2020 target of 28.4 terawatt hours well before 2020. It has been very cheap for consumers. I've plotted year-ahead prices for Elcertificates on the graph you see there. When Norway joined in 2012, the Elcertificate price was around 20 euros per megawatt hour, and the LCOE of wind power was around 60 euros per megawatt hour. So this is something you get on top, of course, of the power price. And today, Elcertificates year ahead is trading around 5 euros per megawatt hour. LCOE of wind power in Norway and Sweden is around 30 euros per megawatt hour today. So investors that are putting their money into wind power in Norway and Sweden, they are investing with very low or no expectation of subsidies. Yeah, a little bit about the financial market. As I already mentioned, the trend here is dropping liquidity. There's the price area divergence in the market, meaning that you have the system price that is the most liquid product, but it's a theoretical price. But it's more difficult to hedge the area price, so you have to kind of proxy hedge your position. And also larger price spreads far out on the curve. So this has implications on the PPA market, and it increases the transaction costs for off-takers like Axpo and for SPVs, because we have to price in the liquidity price risk when we offer PPAs to SPVs. So this is having an impact on the PPAs. And also, the curve kind of reflects that there are a lot of long-term sellers, but not that many long-term buyers in the financial market. So PPAs in the Nordics. So it seems to me like the definition of a PPA can vary a little bit depending on where you're located. So I just wanted to give the Nordic definition of a PPA. So PPA in the Nordic context, that is a fixed price agreement for your power, for a fixed or variable amount of power. So typically an SPV will hedge around 70% of P50 production. It's a direct agreement between the SPV and the off-taker. It can be physical and financial. The tenors are typically 5 to 15 years, and it can be even longer. The trend is longer PPAs. Elcertificates, so the subsidy, and guarantees of origins are typically included in the PPA agreement, but not as a fixed price agreement, but more as a route to market for the SPV. And because SPVs, they have the merchant risk and they also have the volatile subsidy prices, they've been exposed to unpredictable prices and unpredictable cash flow for many years now. And if they have project financing in Norway and Sweden, they need to enter into a long-term fixed price agreement, a PPA. That is something the bank will require, and it definitely can improve sort of the financing solutions for the SPV. So they've been doing this for many years now in the Nordics. Yeah, so the graph on the right just shows the trend in PPAs in Norway and Sweden. In 2012, a fair share of investment decisions were made without PPA, whereas now it's the complete opposite. The trend is longer tenor and very few investment decisions are made without PPAs. Still, some investors start building and commission their projects on equity only, and then maybe do project financing at a later stage, and that's when they need a PPA. I've also tried to illustrate the typical PPA structure in the Nordic market. We have what we call the as-produced contract. That was very common early on in this market. For an as-produced contract, the off-taker takes the whole volume risk for the SPV. So the SPV delivers whatever it produces at any given time, and it gets a fixed price for that volume. So the cannibalization volume risk is left with the off-taker. But despite being in a very hydro-dominated, flexible power system, the tendency has been that off-takers don't want to take long-term volume and cannibalization risk. So the more common structure now is the monthly or profile forward contract, and that's a monthly baseload contract. So the SPV delivers a fixed volume per hour per month. Volume is higher in winter than during summer, so you get a positive, like a seasonal premium on your volume profile. But as a wind producer or SPV, you are left with the volume risk and the cannibalization risk. And then, of course, there is the base load, which is flat over the year. Yeah, so here I've listed typical risk, PPA risk for off-takers. And I won't go into detail on all the risks, but and sometimes they can vary a little bit, like for a utility and a corporate off-taker. But this is something that needs to be managed for any off-taker. It seems in the Nordic market that most professional off-takers, investors, SPVs, they have a very good knowledge on these risks, whereas when we've talked to corporates that are planning or have actually entered into corporate PPAs, it seems like some of these risks have been somewhat unclear. So the risk that I want to mention is the risk of non-construction. Typically, you sign a PPA maybe 1 or 2 years before the actual COD of the SPV or the wind plant. So what happens if it never gets built? So you have massive risk there in terms of replacement risk. So you think you've hedged your power, but actually you haven't. So that's definitely something that needs to be taken into account in a PPA agreement. Credit risk and counterparty risk, very important as well. based on the Norwegian experience, a lot of the traditional industries, they're not used to putting up collateral or offering parent guarantees or bank guarantees when entering into a PPA. So in my experience, this is something that needs to be sort of, you need to discuss very early on in a PPA discussion, because this is something an SPV will most likely require. And then there's volume risk and cannibalization risk. As I said previously, this is something that off-takers in the Nordics are not that willing to take anymore. But from a price perspective, it can look very attractive from a euro per megawatt hour perspective. But it's important to know that you cannot hedge this risk. There are no standard financial products that you can use, and you might actually have to sit on it for the whole duration of your PPA. And then there's market risk. This is, something everyone has to deal with, be it a corporate or a utility, but that's where the corporate has a big advantage, because they can hold their price for weeks or maybe months. I mean, they have a target price that they're happy with, and as long as they get that price, they're willing to hold it for a long time. Whereas other traditional off-takers, they will have to actually agree on the price on the day that you sign the PPA. Because this is just an illustration of how Axpo is managing its PPAs. You buy a long-term, let's say, physical PPA, and the same day you start managing that. So you want to line up corporates that are willing to take some volume within that tenor, and you also actively use the Nasdaq to hedge your risk in the OTC market. And the physical part is handled through Nord Pool and the TSO. So that happens, on the day or days after you have signed your PPA. So finally, corporate PPAs, not much time left. This is what I think are one of the reasons why it has been so successful in the Nordics. First of all, timing, because a lot of the traditional energy-intensive industries in Norway, they have hedges that expires in 2020. So for the past few years, they have been looking for alternatives. Norsk Hydro, aluminum producer, Alcoa are examples of that. And of course, also new industries. You have the data centers that you all know, like Facebook, Google, Amazon, etc. And they have, that leads me to the next point, very strong sort of green values, a green profile. So they want additionality. They want projects where there's been no investment decision. They're also willing to sign as produced PPAs, so they're kind of the dream off-taker for a lot of SPVs. And I think one of the reasons why they're doing that is kind of to strengthen the physics and the green values, like the guarantees of origin. And competitiveness, of course. I mean, 30 euros per megawatt hour. That makes wind power the cheapest new source of energy in the Nordics. That's very attractive for corporates. So price alone is a reason why these corporates are looking at wind power. Some of them don't even care about the green values, like the traditional industries. They don't want the GOs. And then there's the PPA experience. I mean, stakeholders in this market, they're used to dealing with merchant risk and price risk for many years now. So all the stakeholders, the investors, the banks, the lawyers, etc., they are used to negotiating and looking at PPA agreements. And then you have the PPA shaping, where companies like Axpo, for instance, come in, and we kind of help to shape the profile, or to bridge the time gap between the corporate hedging needs and the SPV hedging needs. So we have a lot of companies that offer these type of services as well. Yeah, I won't spend a lot of time on this slide. It kind of repeats the previous slide. But I also think that, when you're talking to smaller corporates, if you're talking to, let's say, Amazon, I mean, they have a lot of lawyers, they have a lot of competence when it comes to purchasing energy, a lot of resources, whereas if you talk to a corporate that maybe have one person that deals with energy purchase, you can't show up with a super complex agreement. So they prefer something that they can hand over to the next guy, that takes over his responsibility and, maybe before the PPA expires. So to have sort of a common understanding and an easy way to communicate contractual framework to smaller corporates, that's something we've seen is very important. Yeah. This is just an example of a corporate PPA and how kind of Axpo helped to shape it. So there's a corporate PPA between an SPV. It's physical. So the corporate wanted a base load, whereas the SPV wanted to sell what I call like a profile forward, a monthly base load contract. So they sold Axpo a physical monthly base load. We sold them back a base load, so it's a profile swap, and paid them a premium for that. We do the balancing for the SPV, and we also deliver the physical base load to the corporate. And also, the corporate wanted to start the hedge before the expected COD of the SPV, so we also include a standalone physical baseload contract to sort of bridge the time gap between the hedge start for the corporate and expected COD for the SPV. Yes, almost done, sorry. So challenges for the corporate PPA market. Additionality and green values have been an important driver for corporate PPA so far. But in a power market that's dominated by hydro, I mean, in Norway, 98% of electricity production comes from renewables. The green value alone is less attractive. And some, as I said earlier, some corporates don't even care about the GOs, which makes it a very low value GO if you sell the power to one party and you have a big announcement that you've bought power from an SPV, and then the SPV needs to sell off its GOs to a third party. And also, what we've seen in the Nordic market is that traditionally industries want to hedge for shorter tenors. So it's sometimes difficult to place, let's say, a 10-year PPA with a corporate. And many corporates are also reluctant to offer buy guarantee. So, for instance, in the IWEA corporate PPA, the Norwegian Export Credit Guarantee Agency, GIEC, they had to guarantee for IWEA's payment obligation. Opportunities for the corporate PPA market. A lot of SPVs are targeting some of the energy-intensive industries in Norway and Sweden at the moment, and we see that a lot of corporates are starting to review their hedging policies, maybe to take on longer hedges and, to look at the wind opportunity. And there's definitely a hedging need for some of these industries post-2020. And then there's the big unknown, new demand. How many new data centers? So, but definitely we see an interest for building new data centers in the Nordics. With an LCOE of 30 euros per megawatt hours and dropping, wind is highly competitive. And if you enter into a corporate PPA, you remove the whole liquidity risk premium if you decide to do it via the financial market. So when prices are at the levels they are today, price alone is a good reason to sign a corporate PPA. And bundling of corporate PPAs. If you have small companies looking to buy a small share of the wind production, or P50, you can also partner up with traditional off-takers to take the remaining volume. So you kind of fulfill the hedging needs for both the corporate and the SPV. Okay, no conclusion if the corporate PPA trend will continue. Yeah, but that's my presentation. I think it might is a good word if you want to be right 100% of the time. So, yeah. Thank you.